We are back, and we are joined now by Jean Su, director of the Center for Biological Diversity's Energy Justice Program, whose piece in the New Republic is entitled "Trump's Election is a Disaster for the Climate and an Opportunity." Jean, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So, rough, obviously, news week and a half at this point. Especially honestly with COP29 and what's the horrible news that came out of COP29. Let's just start there, where we are in combating climate change and what some of the conclusions were out of the conference.
Great. So usually I am at the conference right now, but because I'm very pregnant, so I cannot be there. But my
congratulations.
Thank you. Terrible time for many things. So the conference is still out there. It has one more week to go, but Trump has said that he will be pulling out of the Paris Agreement on day one of his administration. And so we've seen, during Trump era 1.0, he did the same thing. And I think there's a double-edged sword with that type of decision. So, on the one hand, terrible that the U.S., which is the largest oil and gas producer in the world, is pulling out of the Global Collective Action Agreement. And at the same time, the U.S. unfortunately has played a really obstructive role in all climate negotiations, which is why we haven't seen the type of collective action we need. So the potentially one silver lining of Trump pulling out is that we don't have that obstructive force in the collective climate agreements anymore, which means that, really we're looking for global leadership, especially from the EU and other places that have large oil and gas production. And we're looking for them to really step up and get into that leadership vacuum and lead us into a place of true phase out for fossil fuels.
And can you talk a little bit about those limitations from an activist perspective of even the Paris Agreement, or the way that it's been really focused, I think, on the West maintaining economic hegemony while still addressing somewhat along the margins climate change, but not in any real way that would be transformative? Is it your view that it almost was a fig leaf and not necessary for what's the right word? Sufficient. Thank you, Matt. Sufficient to meet the activist needs?
It's totally insufficient, but it is the vehicle that we're working with. So one of the landmark things that happened last year, and so we're on COP29 right now. So last year was COP28. It was in Dubai, which is one of our major fossil fuel producers in the world. This year it's in Azerbaijan, and you can smell the gas out there. They put in the smell so that you can smell it, and so it's smothered in gas. Last year, we had, for the first time in 28 years, the acknowledgement of countries of fossil fuels. Because the Paris Agreement and all of the words that have been spilled on the page of climate change refused ever to write down the words fossil fuels. So last year we had this incredible breakthrough that the countries recognized it, and then they said, we're going to transition away from fossil fuels. So that was the landmark after 29 years saying something like that. And then they had a loophole that said, natural gas could be a bridge fuel, like we kind of need it, and all these other loopholes inside of it. So to your question, is it sufficient? Absolutely not. From a climate activism perspective, what are those COPs used for? They're really important for global action. And I know that sounds a little bit like a contradiction, but that is the place in the world where you have climate activists. And when I say climate activists, I'm not necessarily talking about, organizations that do climate activism, but really people on the ground who are suffering this the most. Friends from Pakistan whose families were completely wiped away by the floods. Friends in Madagascar who, have come because they experienced the first climate-induced famine. These are the people who are being burdened the most by the climate crisis that we in the West are disproportionately producing. So these are the moments where really people can rise together and force people to come to the table. One of the most heartbreaking parts about last year is that we were, we, the civil society and the public, were all pressing for actual words that said phase out fossil fuels. That is exactly kind of the language we need, not this watered down transition off of fossil fuels. And the people fighting at the front of that were all the Pacific Island nations. They are the ones whose existence is completely under literally and figuratively under threat. They are about to go underwater, and they're the ones pushing for the most aggressive phase out of fossil fuels. And they essentially were completely steamrolled over by the West, by the US, by Saudi Arabia as well. And that's why we got that watered down language. But that is the moment in time where people around the globe can face each other and I hope have some type of consciousness about how destructive the West and oil and gas producing nations are.
Right. And the figures that came out of COP29 in the fact that coal, oil, and gas emissions rose by 0.8% last year is deeply concerning, because the target was supposed to be a 43% drop by 2030, and the target was a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase, and we're going to blow past that. So
we're going to blow past it.
Yeah.
And,
go ahead.
And I think for people who, a lot of these numbers are thrown around. The Paris Agreement has two numbers in it. One is 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's the first trigger. But then the real one they say that the countries are committed to is 2 degrees Celsius of warming. But why was 1.5 put in there? 1.5 is in there because that's actually the number where we will see African countries completely roast, where we will see Pacific Island nations go underwater. The developed countries and rich countries didn't want to accept that as the target, so they said 2 degrees. But 1.5 is really game over for our poorest countries around the world. So we reached we are on target. I think we breached 1.5 already in terms of the temperature this year. We are not at that right now, but it'll keep fluctuating. But essentially, we are at a point where it is truly devastating for the rest of the world.
And when you say roast, is that essentially meaning likely mass death in these areas, not just due to increased intensity and frequency of natural disasters, but just day to day in the hottest months, temperatures reaching certain thresholds where, especially in nations that are not as wealthy as the United States, you're not going to have mass air conditioning. You're not going to have places where you can go maybe to hide from some of these conditions. Is that what you're referring to?
That's what I'm referring to, and maybe it's too much of a real word to deal with, but it is incredible heat waves wiping sub-Saharan Africa and in other places where temperatures are hot. But Emma, I mean, the fact of the matter is that the US this year actually experienced the same things. Phoenix, I think, reached over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And unfortunately, in the US, it's not about a rich country versus poor country divide anymore. It's about the rich versus the poor. And in the US, we have seen over this past year that communities all over the South do not have access to air conditioning. Communities all over the North as well, because they are traditionally cold, were absolutely unprepared for these heat waves, and people died up there as well because they didn't have air conditioning. So it is the poorest of the poor. We know of family members who died in trailers that were set up by FEMA in the South, because those are crappy steel material that have no insulation, and people roasted to death because they did not have access to insulated areas. And electricity prices are rising up the wazoo because utilities keep charging us fossil fuel gas prices. And so, the U.S. is in a terrible position on heat. We actually submitted a huge petition to FEMA to actually get money for heat. We have under the Biden administration, no federal recourse for extreme heat, even though that is the #1 climate killer in the United States. So the U.S. Has to get up to shape. Now that we have this president, it's probably not, game over on that end. But those crises hit poor communities here just as bad as in other places.
And you mentioned Biden. We'll get to Trump in just a second, but where did he leave us domestically in terms of initiatives that the Biden administration passed? Obviously, there was some good pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act that was targeted at reducing emissions. A lot of it has based on the promulgation of electric vehicles, which we know is not is not going to meet the moment fully, obviously. But he also wanted to baby drill in his own way. Biden did to. It runs into conflict with union jobs and supporting that, and the future of the planet, and so it's a mixed bag from Biden, from my perspective. But what's yours in your work?
It's a severely mixed bag. Yes, the Inflation Reduction Act was a historic investment, but at the end of the day, compared to what we put in the military, it was just a drop in the bucket in terms of how much money that was put into it. It's supposed to roll out more wind farms, more solar farms, get manufacturing up for heat pumps. All of those are good things. And at the same time, the Biden administration increased oil and gas production at an unprecedented record, even higher than the Trump administration. So it will end at a point where oil and gas production will be higher than the Trump administration, higher than any administration we've ever had. And what that means on the ground for people is really real. The Permian Basin in New Mexico and Texas is considered one of the largest carbon bombs in the world. And the U.S. American oil and gas companies are fracking the heck out of that. And that means that communities on the ground are sucking in this pollution. They continue to die. Those oil and gas products get shipped or pipelined down to the Gulf Coast, where they are exported out. And at that point, we also have communities who are in Cancer Alley, who will again suffer the consequences of those actions. So we have, the detonation of an incredible carbon bomb under the Biden administration. The Trump administration started it, no doubt, but the Biden administration just kept going, and we have all the communities, all the environmental justice communities, Black communities, and poor communities, Indigenous communities, all in the wake of that, of all of that. I think it's really. My organization and so many others around the country for the last 4 years have been pushing the Biden administration to declare a climate emergency to phase out fossil fuels. And there are so many levers that the Biden administration has to actually phase out fossil fuels, starting from, just stopping permits, just saying no to permits, all the way to stopping the export of LNG, which is still underway right now. But we've just seen intractable resistance from them. It's totally irresponsible, I think, for the U.S. to try to phase out its own use of fossil fuels inside the country while exporting all of that oil and gas to other places around the world and polluting them. So it's I think it is a mixed bag, but it's also incredibly contradictory, and it's not what climate science requires.
I mean, just the idea that he approved the Willow Project is the kind of thing where you can't basically have it both ways. And I feel like it makes it easier for Trump to do what he's going to do going forward. I mean, this is the guy that had Rex Tillerson, an ExxonMobil executive, as his Secretary of State early on in his first term. What do you expect from a Trump administration, and how does activism respond?
On the oil and gas front, we will have totally unfettered drilling. it will continue the Biden legacy on that drilling, but there won't be any consciousness or any movability on any parts of this. Towards the end, the Biden administration did pause LNG exports, but it got battered down by the courts. So at this point, we're going to have totally unfettered, but totally honest oil and gas production and drilling from a climate denying fascist. I think that is the question of what the climate movement does from here is a big question. It's a question that is greater than the climate movement, and one that all of us have to grapple with. For anybody who cares about any types of rights in this country, it's a true fight for our democracy. And one of the things that we saw from this election was people are sick and tired of the status quo. People's eggs prices are going up, absolutely. But I think on the other end, from the left side as well, people are sick of this oil and gas production, and people are tired of their utility bills going up and nobody doing anything about it. I think, one of the hopeful points is that we have a chance in the next, 1 to 2 years before Congress, before we have another congressional election and another 4 years for that, to actually build something meaningful in terms of a political system on the, and I say left, but really just not Republican, like not Republican and not MAGA system that of all of these justice-centered concerns, right? And really come together in a super genuine way, stop being siloed, and let's all build something new and put people up in positions who can actually be responsive to what people need.
And how about through the court system? I know that you do some work on that front. Is that an avenue for activism, even in the scenario where Trump has a trifecta?
So it is in the sense of the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court. We're not going to be able to change that. In fact, it will become even, it will solidify its right-wing radical majority because Justices Alito and Thomas will be stepping down and much younger judges will be coming in by Trump. So the Supreme Court is its own monster, and we can't really change that. But they only take a very small amount of cases that are kind of proffered in front of them for appeal, which means that we have all of the circuit courts and the district courts underneath that to try to make some headway in the courts. Right now, there's around 48 positions still open under the judiciary, and the Biden administration is being pushed very hard. They are pushing very hard for Congress to put in as many judges that they would like into those positions. And I think that will be a saving grace in the next 4 years for, to stop much of Trump's rollbacks. The first term that he of the Trump administration, we had a very high success rate of defending status quo regulations. Our own organization, the Center for Biological Diversity, had a 90% success rate. The overall progressive wing had around a 78% success rate. So, I think that there's still opportunities to defend. But I think that's the point. The point is, we're defending what is here right now, which is the status quo. And that's essentially like the first level of resistance. And we're going to have to use the courts to do that. But what about the offense of getting us to someplace far deeper? And I think that's where the political organizing, the campaigning, the unsiloedness of all of our different rights, that's where the rubber meets the road. And that's where we're going to have to be doing serious building.
And lastly, Jean, just the biggest obstacles that you think people should keep in mind when organizing for the climate. I mean, the big one is capitalism in that way, right? Where and it's an economic system that prioritizes endless growth. And then there is this whole subgroup of climate consciousness that is just very capitalist friendly and doesn't necessarily deal with our markets in a way that meets the moment. How can you organize against capitalism under capitalism to save the planet?
That's the golden question, and there are ways. So I love that you put it that way, because I think the Elon Musks in the world and the clean tech bros who have completely supported the IRA are very much market focused. And so they will say the market will take care of it. The subsidies helped for the clean energy technology to roll out. The subsidies also helped Elon Musk get 100% or 99% of the EV market, even though he refuses to acknowledge that. But those are all market mechanisms, and people are banking, that side of advocacy on climate, just emphasizes the market will take care of it. As we know, the market does not take care of that. The market is actually incredibly manipulated, and it's not a free market, by the way. So how can we actually organize around that and get out of falling into these red herrings that the clean energy market will take care of it? So state level work is going to be the shining place for actual pieces to move forward. And are everything from combating the Permian Basin drilling, challenging it in state courts, organizing on a mass level to stop site fights and getting state politicians to actually change their minds. Those are possibilities. In terms of renewable energy, one thing that our team works a ton on is the alternative to these large-scale utility clean energy pieces in some ways, by actually promoting alternative systems of community and rooftop solar. And those are actual resilient technologies. Those are ones that folks in Puerto Rico all the way to North Carolina have said, withstand all of our climate disasters, but they're inherently democratic. And they buck the system of the utilities, the fossil utilities that have put us in this quagmire to begin with, who continue to try to beat down these alternative systems in order to pad their bottom lines for fossil fuels. And now they're trying to dominate more utility scale work. If we organize on those levels, at the local levels, that's where we'll see people fighting back against their utilities, because their utility rates keep going up. They want access to clean energy that they have control over. Utilities keep beating that back. That's where we can organize the people and fight that back. And ultimately, there's also just an understanding of their pocketbooks and how all of this fossil energy or continued reliance on utilities keep breaking people's banks. And so, there are aspects of state level work, and it's local, people understand it, that can be access, basically axes of power for us, of uniting people who care about economic suffering, who want jobs in good, clean energy spaces where they can be unionized, and who want to protect their pocketbooks. So these are all opportunities at a state level that we can make happen.
Jean Su, director of the Center for Biological Diversity's Energy Justice Program. You can read her piece in the New Republic, Trump's Election is a Disaster for the Climate and an Opportunity. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks so much.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.